Good evening, everybody. Monday night, and we are continuing our learning with the book of Rabbi Yitzchak Etshalom, reading between the lines. This week for Parashat Vayera, and he shares a methodological tool which is close to my heart, and uses it to make, I think, a really beautiful, insightful point from the Parsha, which I look forward to sharing with you. And we're going to jump right in. This essay is called Akedat Yitzchak, The Power of the Concordance. It's another long one. These essays usually run about 10 pages, so we'll make our way through and feel free to interject as we go. We'll pause officially at the end for questions and comments. Okay, begins. Perhaps the most powerful and certainly the most basic tool available to the sensitive reader is the concordance. Although as a separate volume, it is barely more than a century old, it was utilized by every serious Bible scholar, including the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash, as well as the great medieval commentators. The concordance identifies each occurrence of a given word everywhere in the canon, such that any difficult word can be checked against other contexts. Unusual words can be linked by their infrequent appearances, and stories, poetry, legal texts, and the like can be linked via their common words or phrases. Even a casual perusal of the Midrashic corpus or the comments of Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and others demonstrates quite clearly that they operated with an open Bible in front of them, using verses in Job to explain difficult verses in Genesis, verses in Proverbs to bolster a contested explanation of a phrase in Kings, and so on. For these giants to whom the entire Bible was always an open book, it was an assumed vehicle of interpretation that needed no justification nor demonstration of its efficacy. I would say, by the way, that the Bal HaTurim probably is the one of the commentaries on the page of the classical, Mikraot Gedolot Chumash, that I would say most frequently kind of utilizes the concordance almost as a starting point. Will comment on words and phrases by indicating the other places that they appear and making links between them. Rashi, the Ibn Ezra, as he references, use it more as a tool in their toolbox. For the Baal HaTurim, I would say it's probably one of the primary activities that you find there. And then there are other, tools going back to kind of the Masoretic notes and other things that, function very much in this way also to highlight other appearances of unique or rare words or phrases. And I would also say, I think even in our computer age, there's a great value to having the physical book, the concordance. A, you can look at it on Shabbat, and B, there's a power to the sort of perusal opportunity that you have, which you don't have with a kind of targeted search. But on things like Bar Ilan, there's an amazing internet tool that we've used in real time here sometimes called Al HaTorah, which has a really nice concordance feature and allows you even to see um, to sort the appearances of a word by book of the Tanakh in which they appear, and kind of relative frequency compared to the length of the books. So the internet has given us some additional tools that sort of amplify the power of the concordance. In this chapter, we will utilize the concordance to gain fresh insight into the journeys of Abraham and the nature of his wanderings. And here, although he capitalizes the C in concordance, sort of means the notion of the concordance, thinking about phrases that appear, infrequently and looking at their other appearances. So the tool at large is something I definitely utilize a lot when studying a story or a section, not just looking for keywords, but when finding an unusual word or a phrase that stands out, checking its other appearances. Okay, introduction of the challenge. The tragic heroism of Abraham, in which every blessing and or divine gift bestowed on him came on the heels of a separation from those near and dear, is well documented and is the focus of many a serious essay. Witness Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik's The Lonely Man of Faith and Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. We will use this particular Abrahamic heroism as the springboard for this chapter. I think one could also say it's not unique to Abraham. I think my father has made this comment. I don't know what um, particular source that you might have seen this about most of the central biblical characters, certainly in Bereshit, having necessarily had a separation or parting of ways or a leaving in order to learn a lesson or have an experience of growth and then return. We sort of see that in the later stories that happen simultaneously with Yosef and with Yehuda. Um, and uh, so there's certainly a trope that extends far beyond Abraham. Whether it was his first separation from father and homeland, his parting of the ways from Lot, the multiple isolations from Sarah, the exile of Hagar and Ishmael, right, where Abraham doesn't go anywhere, but he still experiences a separation because others are banished, or the near collapse of the future on Mount Moriah. In all of these cases, Abraham's greatness and the divine favor shining on him only increased with each episode of separation. Indeed, his entire life seems to have been shaped by the first divine command given to him, naturally, Lech Lecha. God said to Abraham, go from your country and your birthplace and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation and bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Beginning of last week's Parsha, Parsha Lech Lecha. Okay, so this feature of episodes of separation giving way to or somehow being connected to experiences of blessing is the first thing he's pointing out. Although we're given scant information about Abraham before he was commanded to leave your land, and now again we're also understanding Lech Lecha as a kind of not just a first command, but a theme for Abraham's life. That it's like an instruction which actually, in a way, repeats itself over his life. So, although we're given scant information about him before he was commanded Lech Lecha, a significant number of episodes that took place between the ages of 75 and 137, meaning from when Abraham embarks on on that journey to the land of Canaan, which is, of course, the second half of a journey which was begun by his father Terach, until his death at 137, are related, some in painstaking detail. Here's a brief outline of the Abrahamic narratives. Lech Lecha, which has Abraham's immigration, leaving his father and family, then his journey down to Egypt, and his temporary separation from Sarah, then the parting of ways from Lot, and then a first or second promise, the divine promise of the land, and then his settling in Kiryat Arba. Then we have the War of the Kings and the captivity of Lot. We have Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant between the parts, in chapter 15, which includes the future oppression of Abraham's progeny. We have the first episode of exile with Hagar, temporary. We have Abraham's Brit Milah in chapter 17. We have Abraham and Sodom, the visitors. Now this takes us to the beginning of our Parashah, Parashat Vayera, the visitors to Abraham's tent, his plea for Sodom, the destruction of Sodom, and the story of Lot and his daughters. And then Abraham and Gerar, his temporary separation from Sarah, number 2. The story of Yitzchak's birth, the permanent exile of Hagar and Ishmael, the pact with the Plishtim, the binding of Isaac and near death of Yitzchak, the announcement of the birth of Rivka. That's really the second half of our chapter. It includes the 2 chapters that form the Torah reading on the first and second days of Rosh Hashanah. And then the purchase of the cave of Machpelah and the death of Sarah takes us to the beginning of Parshat Chaye Sarah. Each step of Abraham's life that invites God's blessing is accompanied with or preceded by an instance of separation from family. Why are these 2 emotionally charged experiences so intertwined in Abraham's life? Why must he, if he truly must, introduce another measure of isolation in order to come closer to the realization of God's blessing? Obviously, an important question, and maybe lurking behind the question is: are these 2 things necessarily always intertwined? Is this a feature of Abraham, or is the Torah trying to teach us something about the unavoidability of episodes of separation or isolation as a precondition for blessing? I don't think that he assumes that Rav Echelon assumes that that's the case, but he certainly sees it playing out in Abraham's life. I would like to pose, he says, 3 additional questions before beginning our analysis. And we've seen this from Rav Echelon before also, kind of a laying out of the central theme or idea, then bolstering it with additional questions, then presenting his hypothesis, and then trying to resolve the various questions. So we have Abraham's isolation or separation incidents connected to blessing. Now we have these additional questions. One, throughout the Abrahamic narratives, the patriarch is described as a nomad. Even after arriving in the land, Abram continually moves. Where do we find that God's command to Abraham implied a life of nomadic wandering? Right? Lech Lecha didn't seem like it was an ongoing, necessitated an ongoing series of journeys, and yet that seems to happen in Abraham's life. Two, as a detail of the previous question, Abraham's behavior immediately after his successful aliyah, immigration to the land of Israel, is puzzling. God commanded him to go to the land where I will show you, where he will realize all manner of blessings, right? We saw that in the beginning of chapter 12, beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha. As soon as the first hardship presents itself, famine, Abraham abandons the land of divine promise for Egypt. Even if this was intended as a temporary trip, it is still hard to reconcile this behavior with Abraham, who is my close friend, as is described in Yeshayahu, Ohavi. Ramban, who raises this question, goes so far as to say that Abraham sinned in this regard, going down to Egypt as a result of the famine, and that this sin, going down to Egypt when he should have stayed in the land and trusted that God would take care of him, was the cause of his children's oppression in that same land. Can we find some
Um,
way to explain Abraham's seeming abandoning of the land and apparent lack of trust in God? Can we defend him against Ramban's charge? And three, God commands Abraham to go to the land that I will show you, right? We heard that from the beginning of Lech Lecha la'aretz asher areka, and that there I will make of you a great nation, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The clear implication is that all of these blessings are not only contingent on Abraham's taking leave of his family toward the land that I will show you, he must also establish himself there in order to be blessed and become a source of universal blessing. We would expect Abraham, upon his arrival in Canaan, to purchase or conquer some land and establish himself as a permanent citizen and landowner, so that these blessings have the opportunity to take hold. However, Abraham never makes an attempt to acquire any piece of the land until his beloved Sarah dies and he purchases a catacomb for burial. Why did he wait so long to take hold of the land? So we have our series of questions, Abraham's repeated theme, and then issues that arise as a result of that. Many commentators, as early as the Midrash and as recently as the Netziv, have noted that the opening command to Abraham is strikingly similar to the last divine command given to him. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Kachnat binchad yechidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak, Isaac, v'lech lecha, and go to the land of Moriah, Eretz HaMoriah, v'halehu sham le'olah al achad ha'arim asher omar elecha, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about or show you. Compare this with, go from your country and your birthplace and your father's house to the land that I will show you. The pregnant phrases that describe the painful separation, your country, your birthplace, and your father's house, are a near perfect parallel to your son, your only son, whom you love, right? These three phrases to describe the power of the bond, which is now being instructed to be severed. The quixotic trend to find the mountain that I will show you echoes the first divinely directed journey to the land that I will show you, which marked the beginning of Abraham's way. Okay, so we have these at least two or three parallels. We have the specific language of Lech Lecha in both of them. We have the land that I will show you, the mountain that I will tell you, and we have the three phrases describing the connection to the thing which is now being severed in some way. There's yet another parallel between these two missions that bookend the Abrahamic narratives in the Torah. And the bookend is also noteworthy here, right? And in other essays, Rav Shalom points this out. When you determine, when you don't take every episode on its own, but you look for larger structures and you can determine the the bookends, so to speak, of a section, then you can notice things about its structure when you figure out kind of what comprises a major literary unit. And so he argued to us that one major literary unit starts with Lech Lecha in the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha in chapter 12 and ends with the death of Sarah and the purchase of the cave of Machpelah. That's kind of Abraham's journeys. And so when we see things, marking out close to, certainly from the beginning and very, very close to the end, then we have these bookends. So there's yet another parallel between these two missions that bookend the Abrahamic narratives in the Torah. God told Abram that as a result of his leaving kith and kin and journeying forward, he would be blessed, be a source of blessing, and through him all the nations of the world would be blessed. Compare, because you have done this is the end of the Akedah, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you. And I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand that's on the seashore. Your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. Compare that with, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth be blessed. The crowning blessing in both cases, right, the kind of pinnacle blessing, is that Abraham and Abram's progeny will be a source of blessing for the rest of the world. These are the only two places in the Abrahamic narratives where this blessing is expressed, right? Having numerous progeny, inheriting the land, that's in other places. But again, this crowning blessing of being a source of blessing to all the families of the world, that appears only at the beginning and here at the end. There are several ways to understand these obvious and striking parallels. We could understand them as creating a literary envelope structure that helps define the entire Abrahamic enterprise. Alternatively, we could suggest that these two parallel missions help establish the framework for the 10 trials of Abraham. I would like to propose that the relationship between the first Lech Lecha and the final Lech Lecha is more than a literary device. It is at once integrated and causal. In order to respond to our 4 questions above, and to understand the relationship between the first command given to Abraham, right, Lech Lecha, and the Akedah, which also has a Lech Lecha, we need to re-examine a pregnant phrase that informs Lech Lecha while obscuring it. El haaretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. That was part of the first Lech Lecha. Abraham was not told where this land was, although he was already moving in the right direction. He was just told that God would show him the land. How would Abraham know that he had reached his destination? How would Abraham know when he reached the place where he would achieve all those grand blessings promised by God? 2 alternatives seem plausible. 1, if God revealed God's self to Abraham at any point, that might be an indicator that he had already reached the place in question, right? God comes and says, go to the land that I will show you. Then you go on a journey, and if you arrive somewhere and God appears, then maybe you got to the land that God was directing you to. 2, if outside factors supported his settlement there, what's referred to in the Talmud as klitata aretz, absorption of the land, um, that's okay. So that's number 2. In other words, if he found the economic, military, political, and social conditions in a particular spot conducive to settling there, that might be an indication that God was showing him the place to settle, right? Maybe a little more subtle. Nowadays, we don't have necessarily God revealing God's self to us, and we're forced into option 2 to sometimes try to figure out if we could discern God's will by favorable conditions, which is certainly not a foolproof method by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and we don't have the same kinds of promises from God playing out in the same ways. But so we have 2 options. One is a much more kind of direct, and one is much more subtle. Some of the medieval commentators grapple with this issue and suggest variations of the first alternative. I don't remember having noticed these comments in the past, so I found this very interesting. The Radak, just a few verses after the command of Lech Lecha, says, the Lord appeared to Avram right after his entering into the land. God appeared to him at Elon Moreh to inform him that this is the land to which God had referred, right? So shortly after Avram appears arrives in the land, it says God appeared. So Radak says, okay, that's God showing up and saying, you arrived. I told you to go to the land that I will show you. Here you are. This is it. Ramban comments on the command itself, to the land that I will show you. Avram was wandering from nation to nation and from kingdom to another people till he came to the land of Canaan, and God said to him, I will give this land to your seed. At that point, the land that I will show you was fulfilled. So when he gets a kind of continuation of the promise, that's when he knows that he's arrived. He gets a promise about that land. That indicates that that is the land. Ibn Ezra adopts a similar view, as does Seforno, who explains to the land that I will show you, meaning to the place within the land that I will show you by divine visions. Therefore, Abram passed through the land and did not set up his tent until he reached the place where God appeared to him. There are in some two variations of this notion. Once God appeared to Abraham, that demonstrated that he had reached the destination. Alternatively, when God declared, "This is the land," that was the fulfillment. Because both of these happened simultaneously, when Avram entered the land, basically, there isn't a practical difference as to when this verse reached fulfillment, only a theoretical question of which component in that vision represented the realization of that goal, the divine appearance or God's declaration which accompanied said appearance, right? So for a lot of the commentaries, it's, either God showing up or God sort of saying, "This is the land." That happened basically right when Avram arrived, and so we can't necessarily discern which is which. But we're ultimately going to sideline this line of interpretation, but it's good to know about. There's one problem with all these approaches. In spite of God's appearing to Abraham and promising him the land, Abraham does not cease his wanderings. As noted earlier, Abraham seems to continue his original journey, moving from place to place, never settling down, and avoiding land acquisition for many years after the divine appearance recorded in 12:7. It seems clear then that Avram did not sense that he had reached the land that I will show you as a result of the divine revelation documented in 12:7. What was he looking for? Now I'm going to pause here to say, all the medieval commentaries that he cited do seem to think so. So it certainly is a plausible reading, in which case we would say all of Avram's subsequent, wanderings and journeys were each for a local reason in their own instances. There was a famine, so that drove him to a new place. He had a conflict, and that drove him to a new place. He was told to journey through the land, kum hitalech ba'aretz, and so he was going from place to place. So this is not a necessary reading, but it's still interesting. If we think about Lech Lecha as a theme in Abraham's life, and especially with this second point that he never seems to settle down, purchase anything in the land. That's surprising if he's really already been told shortly after he arrives, "This is the place I told you about." So there are other answers to this question, and yet this is, I think, an interesting line of exploration to pursue. Our second proposal above would explain a number of anomalies in the narrative, meaning that the way Avram would have known that he got to the land that God told him was not because God appeared or said, "This is the land," but because he found the conditions favorable. We will review the relevant Abrahamic narratives and note how the absorption, klita approach, our second proposal, gives us a broader understanding of Abraham's actions throughout the narrative. Abraham was looking for an indication that he had reached the place where God intended him to settle and where all of those blessings could be realized. He continued moving south. Right? Vayelech Abraham haloch v'nasoa hanegba. He went towards the Negev, continuing to journey. This is right after 12:7, where God sort of says, "This is the land," which is a continuation of the direction he had been moving in when God gave him his first command. Right? He was heading south, and he continues south. When the famine made the land of Canaan unlivable, he moved further south to Egypt. And this is, I think, a fascinating point. There is no indication in the text that Avram saw that descent as temporary. Although the text said that he went down to sojourn there, Lagorsham, indicating his intention was not necessarily to settle in Egypt, it does not mean that this was not an option if Egypt would turn out to be hospitable for him. How then did Abraham know that Egypt was not the land that I will show you? The hostility that he encountered in his interactions with the Pharaoh, followed by his being escorted out of Egypt, were probably a solid indication that this was not the place. Okay, so we start to explore an interesting line of thought, which is Avram. We're being invited to journey with Avram now with the frame of mind that Avram doesn't know what the land that God has said, "I will show you," is. That he gets to Canaan and God appears to him, but that doesn't indicate, you have arrived and this is your final destination. And so he's kind of still on the move, but he has an experience in Egypt which is so inhospitable that it leads him to believe this can't be the place that God would have meant for me to stay. It's an interesting, framework for thinking about Avram's journeys and what was his frame of mind in terms of reaching the culmination or the fulfillment of his charge to journey. Although Abraham apparently tried to settle down after his return to Canaan, his wanderings continued for many years. For the first time that we know of, Abraham is wealthy, and we can assume that he's ready to find a spot and settle there. Tragedy strikes again. Lot's shepherds have a dispute with Abraham's shepherds. This shows Abraham that the conditions are not yet ripe for proper settlement, so he proposes the left-right split. Lot accepts and takes the Sodom Valley, leaving Abraham with the hill country of the Amorites. This should be sufficient, and indeed the long-awaited word Vayeshev, and he settled or dwelt, right, as opposed to Vayagar, he sojourned, appears at the end of chapter 13. Subsequent, or just pitched his tent, a more temporary sense. Subsequent to becoming enriched in Egypt and separating from Lot, Abraham is now ready to settle, which he does, in the terebinths of Mamre, Kiryat Arba or Hebron. Just as Abraham is settling in, conditions again conspire to deprive him of the security of stable dwelling. The very next verse introduces us to the War of the Kings, a war that seems to have affected the entire land of Canaan, including Hebron. In addition, by virtue of Lot's prisoner of war status, Abraham was drawn into the fighting. At the end of the war, an enigmatic encounter takes place between Abraham, the king of Sodom, between Abraham, the king of Sodom, and Malki-Tzedek, the king of Shalem, which most commentaries associate with Yerushalayim. In the course of their encounter, Malki-Tzedek blesses Abraham and then blesses the God of Abraham. Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God the Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. At last, the great promise is starting to be realized. The promise of, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Right? We just see Malki-Tzedek acknowledging Abraham and God. It was in this place, Shalem or Yerushalayim, where the divine promise attached to Abraham's task to go to the land that I will show you began to become actualized. The next few chapters describe Abraham's increasingly intense relationship with God. The covenant between the parts in chapter 15 and the name change in Brit Milah in chapter 17 complete the covenant portion of the narrative. But at no point in either covenant is there a mention of Abraham settling down. Indeed, the intervening chapter describes yet more instability as Hagar's pregnancy and subsequent haughtiness lead to cruel treatment on the part of Sarah. As a result of this, Hagar flees, only to return at the behest of God and to bear Abraham a son, Yishmael. The lack of settledness continues through the Sodom episode. Note that even after this great destruction, more instability in the land, Abraham wanders southwest to the land of the Plishtim, the Philistines. Since, as mentioned before, there was no inherent reason for him to continue wandering, it may be that Abraham was still looking for that place. The lack of suitable conditions for absorption to this point indicated that he had not gotten there as of yet. The upsetting incident in Gerar, echoing the near tragedy in Egypt, is amplified by Abraham's claim that, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Not only is this not the land that I will show you, Abraham, in his own defense to Abimelech, presents himself as someone who is still wandering. Right? This pasuk often jumped out at me when I read it, and I think Rav Echelom is situating it and interpreting it very compellingly in this framework. Abram says to Abimelech, and it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. Abraham's behavior is consistent with his wandering life, which is not yet finished, right? One read of this pasuk is that Abram sort of saying, you know, I arrived at the land, I'm settled, but whenever I need to go somewhere, I have to do this thing with my wife. But Rav Echelom is sort of reading, God caused me to wander, and that's my ongoing state until now. And this is, the presentation of selves we need to make as we continue wandering. Even the miraculous birth of Isaac is not enough to bring stability to the family. The immediate aftermath of Isaac's weaning party, right, that would be a moment of settling, is the permanent exile of Hagar and Ishmael from the household. Which, by the way, I would say, in that moment, I'm not sure that that is a contrast to settledness. It's an unsettledness in the family, but I think it could argue Avram is now settled in his place, and the people who aren't fitting in are banished from his place because he's established himself. But because it still is an isolation or separation, Rav Shalom reads it as not yet or having arrived fully. Avram then makes a pact with Avimelech, the Philistine king, and conditions finally seem conducive to Avram settling down and realizing all of the divine promises. Nevertheless, we read at the end of chapter 21, and Avram resided as an alien many days in the land of the Philistines. Avram was still a ger, an alien. He still made no move to acquire land and gain permanent status in the land. We finally come to the Akedah. Before looking at this powerful mini saga and its role within Abraham's life, let's remember that following the thesis suggested earlier, Abraham still hadn't found the land that I will show you. He continues to wander, not on account of a nomadic ideology, but because his quest is not finished. His travels to Egypt throughout the land are all symptomatic of his lack of arrival. He hasn't yet fulfilled the first verse in Lech Lecha, upon which all of his success and the success of his seed is contingent. Suddenly, the memory of that first command is powerfully evoked by a hauntingly similar directive. Kachnat bincha yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak, right? The three phrases of connection. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzchak, v'lech lecha, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, asher omar elecha, that I will tell you about or I will show you. Avram's journey is finally at an end. God is going to show him the long sought after place, the land that I will show you. Although conventionally we understand Haaretz Asher Eka, the land that I will show you, as a reference to all of Canaan, right? It's a land. Since any location within Canaan wouldn't properly be considered a land, it would usually be called Makom, a place, right? Canaan is the Aretz. Any sub part of it would not be a land, but a place. The verse explicitly refers to Eretz HaMoriah, the land of Moriah, later identified as Jerusalem, right? So Lech Lechal Eretz HaMoriah sort of opens up the possibility that when God said all the way back in chapter 12 to the land that I will show you, yes, of course, conventionally we say that that refers to the whole land of Canaan, but actually Avram is now being told to go to a place within that land, which is also there called an Eretz, a land, the land of Moriah, later identified as Jerusalem. Is it any wonder that Abraham arose early in the morning to begin this final journey? God was directing him to go back to the place where he had first found a partial fulfillment of the promise, where Melchizedek had blessed him years before. Again, this is assuming that Shalem is Yerushalayim and that Moriah is Yerushalayim, which he does have a scriptural source for from Chronicles indicated above. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. The rest of the story is well known and does not directly impact on our theory. Nevertheless, it's prudent to point out that the name of the mountain is Moriah. Abraham later refers to it as Hashem Yera'eh. God will be seen. All words associated with seeing, as in Haaretz Asher Ar'eka, the place that I will show you or cause you to see. After these many years of wandering, of trying to finally identify the place that God intended to be the locus benedicti, right, the place of blessing of Abraham and his children, it has been found, it has been named, and it has been sanctified. The same place where Abraham was first blessed from the mouth of Melchizedek, right, indicative of the first stirrings of fulfillment of the crowning blessing that other nations of the world will be blessed through you and you'll be a source of blessing, was now the place where the Abrahamic destiny of being a blessing for all mankind was reconfirmed and established. As we saw at the end of the Akedah, that crowning blessing is repeated. That's the only other time in the Abraham story. We finally hear of Abraham settling down in Beersheba with no further disruptions. We hear of this deliberately and pointedly in the last verse of the Akedah story. And Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. We now understand why Abraham was now ready to settle down in Beersheba. Indeed, the next section describes Abraham finally acquiring land in Machpelah. We can now review our questions and respond. And I'll just note one other thing about this little thing about going to Beersheba and Avram living in Beersheba. One of the things that the commentaries often or readers often note about that verse is it comes at the end of the Akedah, and people often comment, where's Yitzchak? Avram, they went up together, and there's no mention of Yitzhak on the way down the mountain, and it gives way to lots of creative interpretation, which I think is also true about the irreparable fracture in the relationship, the trauma that Yitzhak endures. He becomes, a silent, withered figure, and so he's not mentioned. But in light of Rav Shalom's reading, I think we could also just interpret that this verse it's not about Yitzchak. The end of the Akedah is the end of Abraham's journey. Obviously, it has great impact on Yitzchak, but this verse is pointing out to us Abraham finally settles down. And that's not even about family. That's about the end of his own journey, quite personally and quite individually. So reading this essay shed to me a little bit of light on that verse at the end of the Akedah, where it says Abraham lived at Beersheba. The absence of Yitzchak might not need to be primarily about the impact of the Akedah on their relationship. It might be about the fact that the Akedah marks the bookend of this large literary unit of Avram's wanderings, which have now come to an end. We can now review our questions and respond. Why does every step of Avraham's life involve separation from family? Because the blessing originally given involved the growth of a great nation, every one of these episodes of Abrahamic isolation was a clear indication that he had not yet reached the place, that he had to continue the process of Lech Lecha, for he had not yet reached the land that I will show you. He had to continue the process of go forth from your father's house until finding the land that I will show you. Why does Avram continue to wander even after reaching the land? Since he had not yet found the land that I will show you, he had to maintain the nomadic lifestyle. Why did he go down to Egypt, right? That was Ramban's question, indicating that was really a great sin. Because the conditions in the land were not yet propitious for his settling there, he understood this as an indication that this was not yet the place for him to be. Same reason why he ultimately left Egypt. And wasn't a great failing. It was just him reading the room, reading the conditions, and understanding that the charge hadn't been fulfilled yet. Why did he wait until after the Akedah to settle down in Beersheba and acquire land in Hebron? It was only after the Akedah, when he had found the place and had had the full reconfirmation of his blessings, every one of which was repeated at that place, that he was able to settle down in the land. Now, he doesn't actually settle down in Yerushalayim. That's sort of interesting and curious, but we'll leave that as not totally resolved. He's finally able to settle down in the land and begin the process of developing the great nation that he was promised. The birth of Rivka, the seeds of the following generations, is announced immediately after the Akedah saga. We can better understand the import of the Torah's description of Abraham immediately after that piece of land is required. And Abraham was old, well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And for good measure, he says, quoting a midrash which I'm not familiar with, called Midrash HaChefetz, says, "To the land that I will show you, this is Mount Moriah, as it says, V'lech lecha el eretz haMoriah," right? So that concordance-based noticing about the unusual term introducing Moriah as not mountain or place, but land, and linking it to to the earlier point of El Haaretz Asher Areka, that sort of concordance connection is made by the Midrash, as Rav Shalom said at the beginning. The rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash use the concordance as a core tool of interpretation. So here's an example, a Midrash which really buttresses this claim that the Akedah in Genesis 22 is the bookend and the culmination, the conclusion of the journeys that begin in Genesis 12, each of them with their instruction, Lech Lecha. Using the concordance, whether in book, digital, or human memory form, we are able to find connections and associations between and within stories that often help us see them in relation to each other and see how one may be the resolution of the other. So for me, a very rich essay. It's a tool that I love. I think it created a reading that I had never really fully thought about before, about the nature of Avram's journeys. It reminds me of a Rashi about Yaakov rather, which says on Vayeshev Yaakov kind of settled, and Rashi says, Yaakov, our patriarch, wanted to dwell in tranquility, but the nature of a righteous person is that they're always dealing with issues, trying to resolve issues. And so whenever he was about to sort of settle, he encountered another challenge. It's a common descriptively it's a common experience to Avram's experience, but it seems to be for other reasons. But it sort of reminded me of the sense of Yaakov's continual journeys, again for different reasons and maybe different dimensions of experience. But for Avram, it sort of seems to be built into his of story until he's able to find that place and arrive there. Questions, comments, or reactions to the tool, or to the particular reading, or to the Avram stories here? Yeah, Moshe, go ahead.
Um, when God tells him, to leave his father's house, maybe the fact that he wasn't known as Abraham, he was known as Avram. So maybe he had to go through this journey until he finally got his true name. Maybe like the song said, he still haven't found what he was looking for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes.
so he had to go from there and there and until eventually he found the place.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
one of
Yeah.
the and
It's really interesting. I think Rav Echelon might say about that, um, in the framework that he's presented here, the name change happens in chapter 17, and there's still plenty of wandering ahead. So I think he would say, that name change represents an intensification and a development of the relationship with God, but it still comes a number of episodes before the final finding what he was looking for, so to speak. So it certainly marks a milestone on the journey. But I think he would disagree with the claim that the name change is indicative of kind of the conclusion of the journeying. He still hadn't come to that place that God was going to show him, when his name was changed, but he was still getting assurances along the way that he was the right person and it was the right relationship and he was doing the right things, but he had not yet kind of again found or connected with the final destination, so to speak. Lance, go ahead.
Okay. At the very beginning of the essay sermon, whatever you want to call it, Rabbi the rabbi alludes to Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. Are you
Mm-hmm.
familiar with it?
Only peripherally, only loosely.
Right. Well, in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard talks all about Abraham, and he describes Abraham as the true knight of faith. Okay, there we go. And Kierkegaard does it in such a way that it's very difficult to understand exactly what he means by the true knight of faith. And having read that and trying to figure out what the true knight of faith means, I remembered a verse in a poem called The Waking by Theodore Roethke. Are you familiar with that poem?
No.
Okay. The verse is, I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. And if you think about it, that there's a going from Abraham to Lech Lecha, and he really doesn't know where he's going. And certainly as he ascends the mountain, following God's order to kill Isaac, to sacrifice Isaac, he thinks that that's going to happen. But he says he doesn't fight with God. He fights with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, but he does not fight with God over his own son. Right? So now, for me, the true knight of faith is Joseph. And the true knight of faith is Joseph because, first of all, Joseph has an upward arc and he is a journey. And his journey starts with all kinds of problems at home and ends up by his becoming the number 2 guy in Egypt. And it's only because at some point he's trying to find his brothers and an angel of God, an Ish, comes down and points him in the right direction to Dathan. If that hadn't happened, well, then you wouldn't have any of this story. But for me, the most interesting thing here, because we're trying to use one thing to understand another. And my one thing is the Haftorah that goes with Vayera, which is it's about Elisha, the prophet,
Yes. I'm not on top
and
of my Haftorahs. Thank you. Yes.
and there's a story of, you know, the oil and stuff like that, but that's the beginning. The main story is Elisha and the Shunammite woman. And what happens there is God, just like with Sarah, God gives the Shunammite woman a baby, a child, a young boy, who dies, I think, in about one verse or something like that. And the Shunammite woman has given Elisha his bed and breakfast because she is welcoming the stranger. There are a lot of parallels between the portion and between Haftorah. But the key for me is that Elisha is told, first of all, the Shunammite woman goes on a journey to Elisha in order to save her son, or to resurrect his son, I guess. And she contacts Elisha, and Elisha sends out Gehazi, his man, go, you fix it. And it doesn't do it, doesn't work. So now Gehazi himself comes with a journey to the child. And first, I think he recites a prayer, but then the key is that Elisha puts his body on top of the child's body.
Yes, I
Now
spoke about
that
this on Yom
is the
Kippur.
key.
Yep.
Okay, and one thing that illustrates for me is a collaboration between God and man. In other words, it's simply relying on God, simply relying on man is good, but it doesn't really work in many cases. What you need to do is have this collaboration. And what happens with the collaboration, of course, is that the child is, I don't talk about resurrection, I talk about regeneration. I think that's a much better term. Um, Resurrection is, Christian, that stuff. But in this particular case, the Haftorah really transforms the story of Abraham into the story of Elisha. And I think that that's a very positive and helpful story, helpful thing to do. And I think that, by utilizing the Haftorah in understanding the Parsha, we've discovered another tool like the concordance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Yes, and indeed, I think the Haftorah, there's lots of theories about Haftorah selection. Um, Someone recently laid out a nice kind of framework for how to think about it. It was Racheli Barris who taught it at the Bayit between Mincha and Marav one week, and she suggested, one approach of thinking about Haftorahs is a prophetic text is chosen which is meant to elicit, develop, or kind of create a contrast to a theme in the Parsha. Um, and that's the driving force, interpretation of the Parsha. And the second theory is that Haftorahs really were greatest hits from the prophets, meaning the rabbis looked through the Nevi'im and said, what are important texts from Navi that people should know? And then they tethered them to the Parsha in one way or another because, they wanted to find a connection, but it's less about the connection, more about the platform for seeing core prophetic texts. I mean, certainly in the first one, the notion of kind of almost the concordance tool, finding a literary connection between Parsha and Haftorah is part of that methodology is kind of at play. And thank you for the connections between those two here. Really interesting.
Maybe the Haftarah is supposed to like mirror the Parsha.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes it seems to be kind of a straight parallel. Sometimes it's like a skew, to highlight, like a funny mirror, to highlight something or complement without being parallel. So yeah. All right, great. I think again a rich essay gives us a framework for Avram's life altogether. And when you hear in this week's parsha, this Shabbat, when you hear that Lech Lecha come back again, and the land of Moriah and the mountain that I will tell you, we can now hyperlink to the beginning of the story and think about these journeys in that light. So. Great to see everybody. Lainey, a special treat to see you here. Wonderful to learn together. Mazel tov to Nathan and Yocheved on the birth of a grandson. Lots of good things. And we're missing Rabbi Scott Glass tonight. Wishing well for his brother who's quite ill, and strength to their family. So take care, everybody.
Wow,
Thank you.
thank you.
Laila tov.
Laila Tov. Laila
Laila
Tov.
Tov.
Bye bye.
Good night.